Hi, Greg.
Good morning, Obi.
We're talking about the weather right now. So you're saying that so the fog collects in the base of like Petaluma
Yeah, well,
Valley?
yeah, it comes through on these warm summer days as a typical summer pattern. And so it'll be warm up here, but not quite as warm as in the valley during the day. And then at night, what happens is the cool air comes in and it pushes the warm air from the valley up here so that it stays warm up here at night. So it might get down to, say, 55 down in the valley or 65, and it'll be 65 or 75 up here at night. So it stays kind of warm, and it's it's just, I mean, you can feel it. It's like a plane. You can just go down the mountain about a mile, and all of a sudden the temperature will drop 10 degrees.
And remind me what elevation we're at right now?
We're at about 2,200, I think.
You'd think I'd have that statistic memorized after 2 years of sitting here with you.
Yeah.
2,200. Here we are in our ancient laurel bowl.
Yes.
Where it's a gorgeous temperature right now.
Isn't it perfect? Yes.
It is perfect.
Yes.
This is like one of the first episodes where I haven't had to wear a sweater or whatever. Because normally, like right here,
we've been cold.
We've
been wrapped up. It was cold and wet and all of that, but now it's.
What's your gut reaction to the weather this year? Like here we are a few weeks before the solstice, and we're triple digits throughout the Bay Area. And I know we've talked a lot before about the ever widening intervals between like frost events in Sonoma County.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that because I just talked to somebody about the frost events that has lived here as I have for a long time. And they said, oh, yeah, that's true, isn't it? That we used to have those 30, 35 nights over a winter of really frost where the rooftops were lined, and now we're lucky if we have 3 to 5 nights of that here. Well, we have gotten warm weather early on like this, but for the most part, Obi, we here in Sonoma County, Marin County, the Bay Area in general, I think have been living in a climactic bubble where we've had generally quite good stable weather. We haven't had extremes. We got plenty of rain this last winter. But what's interesting is with all that rain and all that grass, we thought we'd be green. It shifted, this warm weather, overnight dried up the mountains, dried up. Everything just dried up instantly. I mean, it was like I blinked driving up and down the mountain, and the weather had changed. It had gotten warm, and all of a sudden the hillsides were yellow. The greens disappeared.
Do you feel like that transition is more dramatic than
absolutely
less of a gradient?
It used to be gradual. For instance, it wouldn't have. Here we had more rain longer, ironically, but we dried up 4 times as fast, which was strange. Usually, here in the past, say 30, 40 years ago, when I was younger. You'd have a very gradual move into the solstice where you'd still have green or wet patches around. And now it is the beginning of June, and it's virtually dry. The hills are dry. Particularly as you go south into Marin County on your way home, you'll just see everything's dry. And that's happened way too fast.
The thermometer needle is so sensitive, isn't it? It's like the homeostasis, the parameters of such a system as you're describing is like when the temperature goes up, and across the California floristic province, it's gone up by a few degrees in the past 85 years or whatever. And because of that few degrees, not only do you get increased atmospheric aridity, you also get increased soil aridity.
Yes.
And that the effects of which I think you might be
I think that's a way to describe exactly what has just happened.
Yeah. How's the creeks? How's Copeland Creek? Have you been up there?
Copeland Creek has water in it.
Yeah.
It has a little less water than normal for this time of year, but it has water. And again, Copeland Creek, even during the dry years, continued to run, albeit very low. But remember, they're spring-fed, and the mountain has so many springs, and underground water.
Right.
But
and after a couple of years of good soaking, some good rain years,
soaking, yes,
those
our aquifers
water
up
tables
here
are high.
are pretty in pretty good shape. So that's a good thing, I think.
Well, I talked to you a couple of weeks ago from the road. I was on a speaking tour, and I went backpacking for several nights in San Diego County. And oh, Greg, it's such a different world. I don't know the backcountry of San Diego that well.
Yeah.
But it was so magical. Just
Yeah.
after it was just down these riparian corridors with these, the deafening roar of bees throughout the day gave way to at night this thrum of frogs that I had never experienced. Like tens of thousands of frogs doing their thing simultaneously, that I woke up in the middle of the night under the stars, and the sound was so loud, and yet it was unified. I'd never experienced this before, but it was like, it sounded to me like an old woman breathing. Like the whole forest was like one breath, like,
Well, the other thing, if you look up
It's
at the
very
stars, it almost looks like the stars are in harmony. They're kind of blinking, moving with the sound of frog songs. What kind of frogs were they? Do you know?
I think they were just Sierra frogs. I think,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
the little creek
Yeah.
frogs.
Yeah.
I know in Santa Barbara County they tend to. I did some backpacking there
Are you
too.
sure
They
there
tend to-
weren't crickets?
I'm sure there weren't.
Okay, because the crickets are really loud too this time of year. They during the day they're starting here. Yeah.
So the frogs gave way then to the steel gray morning sky as the birds came up. Like
Yeah.
all of a sudden I was in a city of songbirds. You know.
Yeah.
Just a bit of paradise for sure.
Well, this morning I was up early, and I opened the door, and in the mornings, not so much now, but in the mornings, you hear just the birds everywhere, and in the distance in the valley, in the mornings you hear the hum of the city. You hear it makes its way up the mountain. You hear that hum of the freeways or whatever down there. But then I just closed my eyes, and the birds created this separate environment out here, up here, which, as you can see today, they keep going.
Yeah.
So, or now. So we have
Isn't
so
that
many. They're
interesting?
nesting everywhere.
So we've got birds, we've got reptiles, we got mammals. Like
Yeah.
this three sort of like vertebrate, terrestrial.
I know what I
worlds.
wanted to ask you
Yes.
about. If you know anything, a friend informed me yesterday that there's some kind of virus that the mountain lions have been catching, and that in the last 6 months, 6 or 7 mountain lions in Sonoma County and one in Lake County have mysteriously died from a kind of sepsis or something.
Oh, that's terrible. No, I don't have
hadn't-
any
and
idea.
I just heard that yesterday.
I
So
don't have any
I hope
idea.
they're not getting any of ours here.
Huh.
I hope they're well.
Huh.
I know the bobcats are well. I've seen bobcats. They're doing fine.
Okay.
They've been here. And the foxes are all over the place with their kits,
Yeah.
getting lizards, and the mothers feeding lizards to their babies. I've watched that.
Yes, yes.
So
Well, that's interesting about the lions. I will investigate that. I drove through Agora Hills, through Thousand Oaks, between the Simi Hills and the Santa Monica Mountains National Recreation Area, and saw the progress they're making on the Wallace-Annenberg Wildlife Crossing.
Oh, great. Yeah.
Wow, what a structure.
Yeah.
The amount of money that's gone into this thing. To alleviate at least one stress vector on lion populations, right, which is that genetic isolation that is happening. The lions are all very inbred in Southern California because of the fragmentation of the roads.
We were moving in that direction here, but because we've got areas where they're coming in, we have males that have wandered quite a ways, and they can wander here. We're able,
Right.
we don't have the freeway situation that Southern California has, so they're not getting killed in the ways, because, you know, the males wander. They get kicked out of the ladies, the women get rid of them when they're about, a year old or something, and say, you got to go out. And so they wander. They end up at the mall in downtown Santa Rosa. They end up everywhere. But for the most part, they haven't been killed the way they are in Southern California. So in Southern California, as you well know better than me, Obi, you'll have one male that's locked in an area his lifetime, and it's his female that's locked in the area, and then their kids or the offspring are the only ones that stay there because they're isolated. So hopefully that crossing will.
Yeah, 10-lane interstates.
Mhm.
That's a hell of a fence.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a miracle piece of infrastructure. We'll see how it works. It's going to work. It's already working. I was talking to some scientists down there, and there's already owls who are using the bridge for nesting, and they're seeing already animals moving. It's not even done yet.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
the word is getting out in the more than human community.
Well, the more than human community is desperate for place. Where you talk about place and purpose, they're desperate for place. And so, especially in Southern California, again, I've told you before, just in these 3 acres that I have here, and again, I'm adjacent to, a lot of open space. But having gotten rid of dogs, the people that were here before, it took about 2 years. But this has become a sanctuary for all, foxes, bobcats, just this 3 acres. Quail have nests all throughout the garden there right now. So they're all over the place. Hummingbirds are everywhere. Whereas, again, a lot of the problem with domestic animals in places is that dogs, and particularly cats, have been so hard on birds and quail and things. So you create an environment, and it doesn't take long where the animals, the non-humans, as you say, will just move in and take advantage of what's healthy and safe.
What's healthy and safe.
Yeah.
Apparently, we have a new lion in Griffith Park.
Oh,
which
really?
is very exciting. So P-22 was famously killed, became a big movie star, really.
Yeah.
Certainly a marquee animal to support this building of this grand wildlife crossing. And there's a few other that are planned, but the thing is, it's only like 9 square miles.
Yeah.
So it's ridiculously small amount of area
for a mountain lion.
For a male mountain lion.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, because they'll go 50 miles. I mean, they'll go great distances.
But they're finding enough resources.
Yeah.
That's another thing. Let's talk about bears for a second.
Okay.
So black bears.
Yeah.
I was talking with a biologist, and this is interesting because I know you're working on your next book. Are you working on your next book right now?
Starting.
Yeah. Have you started?
Yes, I have it.
What does that look like? Is it a box of papers?
It's my notes with paper clips on them.
Yeah. Does that go back years and years? Those notes with paper clips? Like,
oh yeah. I mean, I have stuff all over the place. It's maddening. And then I find stuff and I go, oh my God, this is get going on this. So, but I've been so busy with the tribal stuff and the social justice stuff and everything else that I haven't sat down. And then of course with this new book, I've been doing lots of interviews and things, and so I just haven't had the time. But I'm so ready to sit down and write. It's a part of me. So
well, here we are, Place of Purpose, episode 23, if you can believe it.
Wow.
This is like, I mean, we've been talking now for 30, 40 hours, I guess, if you added up all the hours and strung them like a necklace. It'd be like 40 hours of talking.
Yeah.
And the conversation, I feel, has just begun.
Yeah, and people, it's something, because I don't know I don't know if you feel peaceful, Obi, when we're doing this, but so many of the listeners and people who've watched the podcast say they watch it and listen to it just to feel peaceful.
Oh, that's so interesting.
Yeah, it gives them some hope in a mad world, and in an increasingly mad world. I hope that it is hope. I hope because the moment and the real challenge in these times is to stay, not let the times take all the life out of us.
Yeah.
And that certainly happens so much.
Well, there's something that happens here alchemically, like between you and I. I think it happens between any sort of like caring, introspective, thoughtful, caring, loving adults in this kind of discourse that strikes me, because, as we begin to talk about what I wanted to talk about today, and we have a lot to talk about today, but one of the things that really rises to the top is this technology of dreaming, which we've gone on.
That technology of dreaming.
We've talked a lot about, right? Like this whole instrumentation of this vague psychological process that really eludes categorization, and it gets to like this bigger critique of like how unsatisfied we are with Enlightenment progress, really, right? We're still at the same, like, we're still at like level 0 of what consciousness is.
What's potential? Yeah.
So we enter that fugue state here, like that dream state. Like when we're talking, it's almost like a Noam Chomsky sort of linguistic thing, where it's like we didn't invent. How does it go? We didn't invent language so that we could think. We think in terms of language.
Language gave us the ability to think the way we're able to think.
Thank you. Exactly. Yeah.
So, it's really an interesting thing. I'm a kind of a news junkie, so I go over the news and stuff, and something keeps coming up on my phone, and it says, "Science has discovered the mystery of consciousness," and guessed what it even if it's some kind of nonsense, because you get a lot of nonsense on
what's the title
media.
And what
and it says, and scientists have discovered the mystery of consciousness, and it is that consciousness is connected to everything. And I said, oh, well, that's what the Indians have been saying all along. I mean, and you and I have been talking about that, about how, science is, catching up, and you might want to say verifying with data and so forth what in some ways we've been talking about all along, what Indian people have been talking about, that things are interrelated, that they're communicating, that they talk to one another, that we're not the only species that talks to one another, maybe in language as we know it. But, we had a discussion about how the roots of redwood trees and others are all talking to one another. So these things are happening. They're discovering that some of the dolphins, the killer whales, for example, their speech patterns are more sophisticated than our speech patterns. So, isn't that something that we finally might think that something might possibly be more sophisticated in ways than we are?
Right.
They've only survived and are continuing to survive. I love the fact that these killer whales, if you've read about them, been attacking these ships. Don't you love that? And
apparently they're bored teenage orcas.
Yes, and they're bored and they're having fun. I mean, but even that tells you something, right? What would a teenage kid do?
Just smash it, because we can.
Well, what I used to do as a teenager is we would throw apples and horse crap at cars and run.
Yeah. I don't know how many yachts they've done it to. This is just around the Strait of Gibraltar. Between Europe and Africa.
Quite a few. It's an issue.
It's an issue.
Yeah.
People are scared.
Yeah, they're worried about their yachts, and here come the killer kids. Anyway, yeah, they're bored teenagers, and I think a lot of them were males. Mm-hmm. So they're like these young teenage boys that have all this energy, and what else can we do? Let's attack a yacht.
Oh my goodness. So yeah. So conscious, whatever consciousness, that myopic sort of, we hold on to this idea, like we think it has to be us, whatever we are.
Yeah.
This human quilt, this quilt of biology. Is consciousness just sort of like epiphenomenon related to, like, resultant from neurology, right? Mm. And that's a very that could be a type of it, mm-hmm. but it doesn't incorporate the whole realm of survivalist strategy.
Yeah,
maybe that's tied to it too. Like, so I was talking about birds, mammals, reptiles, and we're going on hundreds of millions of years of all three. They've all been sort of like gearing up to this moment.
The term that you scientists use, co-evolve.
Co-evolve.
Yeah.
Co-evolve. Yeah. And through like it's fascinating to think that most people, consider dinosaurs to be reptiles. It's like, well, probably not. The non-avian dinosaurs all died out 66 million years ago.
Yeah.
They were working on bird-like technologies to think of the homologous, like, nature of hair and feathers.
Yeah.
To insulate one's body, to regulate one's body temperature and type. And then all of the different resourced opportunities you have in the landscape. Mm-hmm. Driving up here today, driving up the mountain, it's just like so many vultures, so many ravens.
Yeah.
detritivores.
Yeah.
They had the cleanup crew.
Yeah, yeah.
It's such a necessary.
Yeah.
You think of them as sort of dirty birds.
Yeah.
Like, oh, that's just like a crow or a vulture. Imagine how. I mean, there's without them, they keep the world clean. They keep the land clean.
Well, and they've been around so long, and and by the way, have adapted. They're not endangered. I mean, because one thing, we've given them so much roadkill and junk to feed on, and they're very, particularly ravens and crows, are so adaptive. I mean, they're very clever and smart and have communication skills. And I've told you before, right up here, right now, they're nesting across the road here. Every year they come back to this large hollow in one of the old bay trees and nest. And I'm speaking of the vultures, and they are amazing birds. There'll be a family of like maybe 8 to 12, and there'll be one or two of, I guess, or a female that will lay a couple eggs, but the entire family partakes in watching the tree, checking the tree, making sure that those babies, when they come out, are taken care of. And it's amazing that they work in these family units and cooperate with one another for whatever young are born.
Yeah.
Wow. It's just amazing to watch them. And because from my office, I look across the road and I see them sit and move in different places and watch them. And they come back every year to the same place, as do birds in bushes right here. If you stay in a place long enough, Obi, it's amazing, because I begin to understand how my ancestors understood a landscape so well. Because if you stay in a place, you'll start to see patterns each season that the animals take, when birds arrive, when they leave, and they'll come back, as long as it's safe, to the same bush, the same tree, to nest with their families time and time again. So you get to see, they're almost like your relatives. Oh, they're back, they're going to be visiting. It's the same ones. So it's pretty amazing. The same bobcat that's come back, there's a female that comes back now, and she has her babies here. And you see her at certain times come around, and you see her heavy, and then after she's had those babies and she's feeding them, she's very thin. Yeah. Because whatever she's hunting, she's giving to the young.
Wow.
But she does it by herself, and that's the other thing. When she's around with those babies, you don't see any males. So you notice these things just by sitting here. And I'm not a scientist. I'm just somebody who's observing what's right here. And I've been here now 19 years. And so I've seen, the patterns and so forth. It's amazing.
It is amazing. So I wonder about wealth in the people. How abundance is created. The bobcat gives everything in this sort of like almost this Jungian complement of like sacrifice and bliss. There's an archetype there somewhere. I give all of my body to my children because this is how I am wealthy. And you've said before, like the stories are the source of so much wealth. And part of the creative impetus for you to tell these stories is to increase your wealth paradoxically by giving it all away.
Yeah. Isn't that the essence of life, that you pass on so that life can go on, that you pass all of us. All that we have is stories. And I was thinking of something earlier, because I've mentioned this before, but the old people would always say the richest person, the person who dies with the most stories is the richest.
There it is.
So the one who had the most knowledge, the most stories, becomes the richest. And again, a couple things about that. One, it's about, as humans, that's all we have to pass on. Yeah, we can pass on how to grow things or how to do certain things, but it's the stories that we have, whether it's how to plant a tomato or how to harvest acorns, or stories that remind us and make us think about who we are and our relationship to the landscape. That's all we have. Stories are ultimately our only power. They have the power, as I've said before, to kill 6 million Jews.
Right.
They also have the power to create conflict in the Middle East.
For sure.
But they also have, and why you and I sit here and tell stories and stuff, they have the power to heal and to say, hey, there's another way. These are other ways that we might do things, so that we might have a sustainable future, so that we can learn to live with one another. And a lot of them have the old verities of greed is problematic, because greed doesn't allow you, it just what you just said, greed makes you hold on rather than give away. And all we can do is give what we know. Holding on to material things, not only does that take from the landscape more than we need, which, by the way, none of the other creatures do, because they're not afraid in the ways we are. But we must pass on. We must give whatever we have, and live that way. If nature teaches us very interesting things, just as you said, Obi, they give everything almost to the point of starvation. You see mothers, the bobcat, very thin. You see birds just working constantly, going back and forth with something in their mouth so that life can be sustained. That's it. And our worms that we give our youth, our young people, or we pass on, whatever animal we're giving to our kids as a bobcat does, it's stories.
Sticking for a moment on this idea of stories as wealth and adding an economic dimension, because I mean, it's you and I can talk about wealth as stories for half an hour and not mention the word money. You know, it's like, okay, so what is what's the paradigm at work there? And I think there's an indigenous critique here that I'd like to explore with you. It's like John Smith, Wealth of Nations, pointed out that like capitalism, this is like a bit of circular logic here, I think, that capitalism is like part of human nature, was what part of, one of the founding moments of one of the founding precepts of capitalist doctrine is that that we find it in indigenous cultures. We find objects moved, we find turquoise from Mexico and Michigan, and we trade. But was it trade? Like, that's the circular logic. It must have had an economic dimension. Therefore, it's always existed. Therefore, capitalism equals human nature. But you just said it's story. It's like collecting stories. And that would be, I think, an indigenous critique. It's like, does it have to be economic? Or do these objects like become the story of the adventure of going there?
Well, I
think
the story teaches us how to think about economics, economic relationships. There's stories like John Smith, who you just mentioned. There's stories that will say that capitalism has always been there as a way to justify the accumulation of material things. And there are stories that say the accumulation of material things is problematic and can create problems. So which story are you going to tell about the economy, and how, as a consequence, is your economy informed, right? How is it informed? We feel that one of the assumptions in the West is that, the more you have, the safer you are, the better you are, all of that sort of thing. And you need enough, but how much and to what extent must you take from the landscape at the expense of the landscape? And that's where our stories say that's where you draw the line. Capitalism doesn't see the landscape. It's how much we can get from one another via war or outwit somebody or be smarter, that they say is nature. It's human nature. Well, it may be. We may be scared, and we may all of that.
Well, that's the money resource.
That's the money resource. Yes.
The money. It's the fiction.
Material stuff.
The fiction.
Yeah.
that quantifies the energetic relationship between you and I and these things called dollar bills.
Yeah.
You know.
Or the justification for the dollar bill.
But going back to material for a moment, because I can't help but think that we're dancing around similar concepts here, as far as like a materialist concept of consciousness.
Yeah.
It seems to be something tied to the Enlightenment, tied to even economic systems that we need to like focus in on. There is no materialist definition of consciousness.
Well, no, right. But just remember, the Enlightenment privileged reason. and reason, as many philosophers, including Gregory Bateson and others, have said, reason is only as good as long as it knows its limits.
Oh, it's as long as it knows. That would presuppose that the core of the story is some sort of power structure.
Yeah,
I would say.
Yeah,
because there are egalitarian reasonists. I mean, you think of 17th century in Northeast America. Most of these Enlightenment thoughts came from Native American cultures who had a much different idea about what reason is as in its relationship to power than Europeans did.
Well, or what enlightenment was.
Oh.
I mean, Kant and the others had a very different idea of what enlightenment was than indigenous people did, because.
But it was informed by them. Like, you wouldn't have had Rousseau, you wouldn't have had Hobbes, you wouldn't have had without the discovery without the new example, the new paradigm, arguably from the New World. I mean, there were incredible populations there that were functioning democratically in a way that never existed in Europe. I mean, how could that not inform?
Right, but it was enlightenment again. Let's just take basic concepts of enlightenment, that we are separate from nature, that we have reason and other things don't have reason, and reason is the thing that gives us privilege.
Okay.
All right. So that's enlightenment is in many ways is it can be very dangerous. It's important, and what you mean by enlightenment. Indigenous people, we were enlightened, and again, remember one of the things that when they did come and discover the New World, the assumption was that we were stupid and lacked reason, and that was justification for dominating us.
Yes.
In one of the
Oh,
justifications.
I see. Yeah, for sure.
So.
Because the story that they were telling, and I think it all gets back to like literary criticism. I think that is like there's so much philosophy, there's so much psychology and religious paradigms about the story that we're telling, and we use this word story a lot, and we haven't really defined it yet. And somebody on our comments on YouTube for one of our last episodes says, would you guys define story?
Yeah. Which
I think is a great idea. So one of the definitions I've been playing around with story is like, really it's a description of the mechanisms by which you see the world.
Well, yeah, or it can come to understand the world.
Right.
But at the same time, it can also, story can be used to question those assumptions.
Yes.
So it just depends. Story is like anything. It's how you use it. And again, we have language, and it's the only thing we really have. So story is like immense power. I would call it that.
Yeah.
Because it has the power to influence entire nations.
Okay. Sure.
And so, I mean, right now, look what's happening. There's two stories that somehow can't come together in this country. There's two different descriptions of reality. And the problem is that neither one seems to question itself or enable the listener or the believer to sit back and say, does this have its limits?
The algorithmic distraction that the greatest story is somehow the social war, for example, that could lead to real war. Unlike what you said before earlier when you said you sit on the land enough and it reveals itself.
It'll tell you a story that you can put into language.
And what you choose to be the land, is the land the conceptual space of America, right? Or is the land the conceptual space of my occupation or
it's probably all of those things.
It's all those things.
All of those things. And remember, stories
but in your books, this is the land is
The
is
informant.
the informant.
Yeah.
The land is the central axis from which all of the concepts spring out.
Yeah.
As opposed to something like
More abstract.
like the individual. I think a lot in this enlightenment.
The land
thought.
gives you an idea instead of the idea giving the land, telling the land what it's about.
Yeah, that almost sounds like a Mabel McKay quote.
Yeah.
Well, Mabel said something about like the story will inform you.
Yeah, and that's just what we're on the same wavelength here, because Mabel always used to. I once asked her, what does it mean? And she said, don't ask me what it means. Life will teach you about it the way it teaches you about life. So stories can put you in a dialogue with the world and the landscape. So, but also inherent in that idea, Obi, I think, is that stories, we have to remember, are fluid. They change. One of the problems is we want to think that the Bible or any of these sacred texts are so fixed and that we have an idea, the right idea.
Oh.
What happens is you'll have 20 people read the same thing and come up with different interpretations, which is great, until they want to fight or kill each other over those interpretations.
Yeah.
Because they're fooled by the myth of a story being fixed, even if it's in a text rather than fluid. Because a story that's written is only 50% of the story. It's waiting for the reader. The reader makes the other 50%.
Oh, that's gorgeous.
You know, well, it's true. So, I mean, think about, as I tell my students, when you're 18 or 20 and you read Romeo and Juliet, it's a lot different from when you're 70.
Yeah.
It's not the same story.
It's not the same story.
And so even as you change, the story itself changes.
Mm-hmm.
And you have a different kind of dialogue with it. Maybe when you're 20, you see the romance. When you're 70, you see the tragedy.
That must be a sort of a retort to the criticism that the stories that you tell are not necessarily ancient stories.
Yeah,
right?
and there never was an ancient story.
Right.
They were always emergent. They were always fluid and changing. And one of the reasons it pretty much kept us from a lot of wars is we didn't sit there and insist that our version was the right version. You know, we didn't get insistent that it was the right version. Some of my people, like when I wrote How a Mountain Was Made, and I recreated some of the old stories, people said, oh, he added on to those things. They weren't right. You know, he fixed those. And I said, well, which were the right ones? And they'd go to these texts that were recorded by anthropologists. And only slivers of the text. And I said, let's contextualize how that story was told. That elder or whomever was telling the stories was being paid to tell stories out of season when we didn't tell them. Do you think they're going to tell the story to an anthropologist the way they tell it to one of our own people? No. In fact, I was a young man watching an anthropologist. I think I told the story before. A woman, an attractive woman, who came and paid this older man 50 cents or $1 a day to tell a story. And then I wasn't there, but I heard him later at the dinner table laughing with another old man, talking about how he told a coyote story about a coyote's penis, how it crept up around somebody's neck. And he said, I was just seeing how far I could get before she'd stop writing, and she kept writing. So he's just playing story. So, you know, again, I tell my people, many of those stories have been altered, or they're just slivers of pieces. And remember, a lot of our people were poor and needed money. My great-great-grandfather, Tom Smith, was very clear. A younger woman who was telling the stories, Maria Coppa, there's a story about how he slapped her and said, don't tell them the truth. Just make up stories and get the money. Don't tell them the truth. And he said he was telling the stories to this woman who was a student of Alfred Kroeber's for two reasons. He liked looking at her legs, and he wanted to make enough money so that he could get buried in a suit.
There it is.
So, you know, parts of those stories might have been kind of true or not or whatever, I look at those texts, and I think Maria Coppa was telling more truthful stories, and my great-great-grandfather, his stories were really inconsistent. They were contradicting each other. He was just sitting there BSing a lot. So again, we can't. You have to be careful.
Yeah.
We have shards of the old stories and the ethics of those and aesthetics of those old stories, and we build on those, trying to keep those ethics. But they're going to change, and if they can teach the same things in new and emergent ways, what else do we have?
Oh, I'm so excited to talk to you like this. Like there's a couple of things. Yes, stories not as decorative objects, not as artifacts for some museum, right? There's this fetishizing, especially about the Native American story.
Absolutely, or our baskets, or our cultures.
Right, exactly. No, these are humans and very much alive in real time. But your stories now, I also think of like Genesis 1, in the beginning was the Word across the water, and this is not real. This is true. Very different things, which is a dynamic you have to wrap your mind around when you walk into the Forgetters.
Yeah,
it's like no, this is not real. It's true.
Yes, I love that. It's not real. It's true.
Yeah.
Or as Mabel would say, whether you believe it or not, it's true.
Oh, okay. That's even better. The believing.
Yeah.
The believing that what you are in your material consciousness, in your material body, a thing that is imbued theoretically with this idea of consciousness, that you have the Word over the water, the logos above the chaos. And like, okay, we'll start there. But like, I see like in all of your stories, and I've been trying to, the blurb on the back of the Forgetters says it's like the classic Southern Pomo creation myth, which I think is
and that's
wrong in a lot of
and that's been I just have to say that's been a problem of marketing the book, because you can't market a book. Some people want to hear about Indian myths, but they're not that. They're that and more. I mean, they use some myth, but they're contemporary stories that have very Western structures, with very much a beginning, middle, and an end. Right. And a surprise ending. So you get that kind of
three-act structure.
Yeah.
But there's also there's the three parts. Every one of your stories, especially in this latest book, which we talked about before, is like these three books form sort of a trilogy, from How a Mountain Was Made, 2017, through Becoming Story, 2022, to The Forgetters, which is 2024, where it's sort of like the childhood, the adolescent, the mature voice coming through these stories in this sort of like meta level interpretation, analysis of what you're presenting here in this three. I want to talk to you about like illustrating and mapping out like maybe a grand edition of all three books together.
That would be amazing.
But
only you could probably do it, or do it well.
So you always have a protagonist who is sometimes named. In the Forgetters, I think this is the person that needs to do the remembering.
Yes.
Sometimes it's the world itself.
Yeah.
Like I have a problem with the idea of creation story. Because I don't think these are creation stories. Because
no, they're not creation stories. And by the way, the interesting thing about the indigenous point of view, let's just jump back even a ways here. Genesis is very much a creation story. There was this, and then there was this, and then there was this, because there was nothing. And we have stories where there was just water, and then Coyote did this or did that or whatever. But then again, you'll see things that undermine that there was a world already there. For instance, one of our creation stories is that Coyote, when he created the world and everything, he was married to Frog Woman up here on this mountain. And Frog Woman, they had two children, two sons, and he got jealous because she was spending too much time with her sons. And she was always busy down at the creek leaching acorns and washing clothes and doing whatever. And so he took one son while she was away and threw him up, and he became the moon, and threw another one up, and he became the sun. And so the story goes on, and that she came back and says, "Where are my children?" And he said, "Well, you don't have enough time for me, woman, so I got rid of them." But you can always see them because one's in the day and one's at night. And of course, the story goes that the ideological tag is that's why she's always sitting like that, because she's always looking up at her sons. But she got upset and she went back to and started crying, and her tears became the creeks and the rivers and all of that sort of thing. That's how the fresh waters were all created and all of that. But wait a minute. And this is where the ethnographers go berserk, because they say, but she was down there leaching acorns in the water, so how did you create water? We don't care about linear time. It's the stories and what they're telling.
Neither do the monotheists.
No.
The word was moving over the water before God created water.
Yeah. Yes. So
the words.
Yeah, the words. So what came first? The word or the water, or the chicken or the egg?
Or the sorrow?
Or the sorrow.
I mean, when Coyote did that, when he threw, according to your story, which appears in How a Mountain Was Made, he brought death into the world.
Yeah.
There's almost like the bifurcation of the sexes, the original sin, the exile, which the tears represent. There's almost like a
and notice what goes
with
back to what we started talking about at the top of this discussion, Obi, is that she was giving everything and working for her children. He got greedy, call it sexually or whatever, and wanted more time with her that would take from that. And he lost everything. He lost the sons. Mm-hmm. He lost everything. So those again.
And he comes into a great, into a realm of self-consciousness.
Yeah.
Which is sort of an exile from the garden.
Yeah.
Which is, and because of it, he becomes worthy finally of leadership.
One of the things that I wrote years ago in a novel that I'm still working on, or we'll get back to one of these days, is when a young kid who's been on the mountain for a while, he realizes that perhaps the first story that was ever told was the first time a human being realized he or she or they were separate from the world around them. All we have to explain what we see is words. Mm-hmm. And so consciousness itself, it becomes the Bible of the story of Genesis. All of these stories have something to do with the dawn of consciousness and language and use of dawn and language. Mm-hmm. They all do. And in that way, we're all kind of lonely creatures telling stories to explain ourselves. And we should realize the subjectivity of those stories.
Okay.
And talk to one another about them instead of fight over them.
I think that's where the indigenous critique comes in. And I want to bring this back to almost an economic dimension too, because what we had in California for thousands of years apparently was an incredible proliferation of what can be called, and I call in my new book on fire, I call it pyrodiverse economies. Mm-hmm. And that, I think Stephen Pine coined that, the fire historian. I think, or maybe it was Kat Anderson, one of these researchers into examining why was there so much fire and how much fire was there in California? Mm-hmm. So much fire all the time, And this was this energetic release, which I think had ontological implications. Ontology is just the story of why the story of why things are the way they are. Okay, mm-hmm. So
and it had so much to do with the animals and birds that were here.
Right.
I mean, we talked about coevolution. It had everything to do with that.
Right. Absolutely.
I mean, notice, once you stopped burning, look at how the landscape changed.
That's right.
I mean, so you can see that. And again, the notion from the Europeans that the Indians were just sitting here, they weren't doing anything, they were lazy, they just walked around naked all day and wove baskets or whatever. Our burning, intentional burning, was such an instrumental part of the environment in which we lived and what the Europeans saw, but did not for a moment understand the minute they came here, except to think that we were burning everything all the time, as you said, Obi, to not let their cows and horses eat.
The first laws they passed.
To
such a degree, though, that when the horrible pandemics of the 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th century came through, that the fire regimes, the anthropogenic fire regimes, were so suppressed that there was so much growth because of this massive comeback of growth, that so much CO2 was sucked out of the air that it caused the little ice age. Like, there's also, reverse of the Atlantic Oscillation and some other factors in there too. But it was Europe was frozen for 200 years after contact with North America for a reason that could have been anthropogenic.
Yeah, absolutely. But the other thing to realize is once you have all this growth combined with the introduction of annuals, the shallow-rooted oat grasses and things that sucked all the water out, the water table dropped so quickly here, and that too transformed the landscape. Almost overnight, within a generation or two, the landscape became unrecognizable.
Yes.
So many things happened at once.
It's true.
The suppression of burning, which was a huge thing, combined with the people who did the burning taken into the missions as slaves so they couldn't tend to the landscape anymore. And then the introduction of these new animals, and then the grasses that came that sucked the water out, that destroyed, that didn't allow the deeper rooted bunch grasses and things to grow. Just Obi, it happened overnight for Indian people. You could have been 10 years old, and by the time you were 60 or 70, look at the world, and it wasn't the same anymore.
That's right.
Think about how fast that happened.
Right. It also makes me wonder how fast we could not return to it, but learn, adapt, evolve, and become resilient because of the recentness of this. This is what I posit from the core of my being, and why I enjoy sitting here with you every month. It's like what is there to learn here? Because there's a critique here that I do not see expressed in larger economic theories about what is happening in the 21st century. What is the structure of the story that we can tell? What can we learn from this?
You just hit it, Obi. We're onto something here towards the end of our many episodes here, or this season anyway. Obi, you just hit on a vision of hope. It was transformed in a dangerous way so quickly, just as easily, I believe, if we, even though there's so many more of us here now dependent on the landscape, I believe that just as quickly, in a lifetime or two, we could again recreate and manage, and I always use the word manage because Indian people managed, manage a landscape and a world, an environment that would be sustainable. Yeah. There's more of us to do the work, so we can do it even faster if we would.
You, in that context, are the only one who I trust with that word sustainable. It's such a marketing word that means nothing.
Oh,
don't show me your 5-year business plan.
No.
Show me your 100-year business plan, and then we can start talking.
Exactly. I'm so sick of I'm glad you brought that up, because it's the greenwashers, one of their big words. I mean, the oil companies are using that word on advertising, on televisions I've seen. And again, it's silliness. Again, but there's things we could do. I go back to that quote from the great Irish poet Yeats, who said, "This preposterous, pragmatical pig of a world would vanish on an instant if the mind would but change its theme." Right. And if we could get back to where we were comfortable with one another and work towards resolution, the money spent on war, on ammunitions, and all of that, it could be spent on the transformation of lifestyles and environment and food production and all of those kinds of things.
I agree. I think the reason why my 6th book is going to come out in September, the State of Fire: Why California Burns, and I propose that it is fire on the land in California as it has always been, so shall it be again in the future. That has the potential. Our capacity to transform the story of fire in California and modern California society in the past 170 years, since power has been centralized in Sacramento as a political entity, California, the story of fire on the land has been 100% destruction, 100% tragedy. That's all you hear about. Oh, the fire! Oh God! Yes, of course. But what if we were to change our mind in this pig of a world?
Yeah.
And celebrate it as an endemic vector of nutritive regrowth and resurgence. That it is. Okay,
Yeah.
so this is changing the story, and I think if we could do that, this transforms the economy.
Yeah.
Because it attaches itself to all realms of human political, economic life, from healthcare to software technology to landscape design to all manner of things change when we embrace the burn.
Yeah.
And embracing the burn means leaning into the idea that pyrodiversity equals biodiversity, and through biodiversity do we get more secure ecological services. And this is not theoretical. The people of California have been doing it for potentially tens of thousands of years.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right, Obi, but there's huge challenges today that there weren't then.
Of course.
And that's the real issue, because you've got private property and pieces of land here and there. And so how are you going to do it? The climate itself has changed. The winds have changed, upon which those old fire doctors were so dependent on reading the environment. So you did it in a way that the fire wasn't became out of control.
I'm suggesting that there's something core that you and I are licensed here to wrestle with, between what might be true or not, this sort of Neolithic package that was sort of quote unquote invented in the Middle East between settlement, livestock, and agriculture. Mm-hmm. Right? That the land becomes then property. Property existed. It was a different sense of property here, mm-hmm. in these pyrogenic agricultural societies that these hundreds and hundreds of tribes around California.
Well, there were territories
territories,
and yes, they were, and we were protective, and not in the sense,
there was a social contract.
Yeah, not in the sense that we owned them as such, as ownership as you know today. But you were, ultimately, no matter how you viewed it, you were responsible for taking care of it. Because to the extent that you didn't take care of it, it affected your neighbor's territory, yes, which would create consequences and conflict with you. As I've often said, most of our villages and so forth were on bodies of water or near bodies of water, which were connected to other bodies of water. So if the water wasn't taken care of and you weren't taken care of, you couldn't trade. If we didn't take care of the streams and creeks up here, the people in the Laguna would be mad at us, and vice versa. It went like that. As I've often said, the state of water, the health of the water, was indicative of the health of the politics.
Yes.
And that went for everything. So if you overburned or did something, burned somebody else's territory, or did something, or weren't taking care of what you had, it would create political strife. So rather than seeing ownership as something that is us versus them, right, ownership becomes, I'm responsible for taking care of this so that you will have I am taking care of you at the same time. You must then take care of your territory to take care of me. And the extent that we aren't taking care of each other by caring for the landscape is going to create conflict. It's as simple as think about when your neighbors are, building up a big fence or smashing, or dogs barking or causing problem. You're upset. You start fighting with your neighbor.
Yes, exactly. What you're describing there is a third option to the sort of false binary between capitalism and communism.
Yeah, exactly,
You know,
Obi. Yeah.
and it's like it's the indigenous critique I'm talking about, and I do not envy you as a leader and a chairman that you are burdened with implementation. And in this space, I think you get to dance with this identity that I think you're most comfortable with, which is the author and the artist.
Yeah.
You get to plant those seeds deep.
Yeah.
You know, we're not going to, in our lifetimes, we're not going to see what we're talking about necessarily. When you say there's a lot of things going on right now, it's like, yeah.
Well,
but I think that this is a navigable route.
Yeah.
You know, through these bottlenecks.
Yeah.
That have been, imposed from within and without.
Yeah.
Towards abundancy, and it has to do with feeding back in. It has to do with a circle instead of a line.
Well, imagine, we talked again at the top of this conversation, Obi, about these 3 acres. And I work to, I can't burn, but I keep things up as if they were burned.
Yeah,
and by taking care of this landscape the way I am, it not only brought in lots of other animals, but it could spread. They could take care of their plot. They could take care of their plot. We could begin to create communities of ownership that really became communities of responsibility.
Yes, exactly.
So that can happen.
The fire mimicking process, this isn't a food
Mimicking,
producing.
yes,
This
yeah,
isn't
yeah.
a landscaping.
Yeah.
This isn't a food producing landscape here, but you're not letting the Douglas fir trees and the conifers come into your laurel and your oak.
Well, it is a food producing. If you look at the acorns and you look at the pepper nuts,
You're absolutely
and the
right.
birds and animals sure
You're
think there's a
right.
lot of food
No,
here.
You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right.
But I want to say one other thing, and I've never had a chance to say this, and I've been thinking about wanting to say it more, Obi, and that is, yes, I'm a political leader. In fact, in an interview just earlier this morning, they said, how have you been chairman for, 16 terms? That's almost 32 years. And as somebody at Stanford who was interviewing me, another American Indian person, he said, you must be mentally ill. And maybe I am. But I think that our leaders need to be poets and writers and visionaries. Our political leaders need to be informed by story more. It would be helpful, I think. Maybe I'm just prejudiced because I think that, as I always tell my students, it's not a sin to think. So I think that maybe that's a unique perspective, that I am an artist and a dreamer and all these things that you and I talk about, because it can inform my leadership and politics.
Well, you had these threads, with these old women who you grew up with who I read an interview with you recently that took place a long time ago. You were talking to Malcolm, and you were talking about how the Pope wanted to meet Mabel.
Mm-hmm.
And she said something like, yeah, bring him on by. We'll go to Happy Steak.
Well, first she said, I liked what she said first.
What?
I was so excited because, I was a young guy. I thought I'd get to see this dude with his beanie and all that stuff. And his robes, because, how many people get to... And in those days, I was, as they say, driving Miss Mabel. I was driving her around. So they contacted me, and I called her up, and I was all excited. And I thought, she'd be excited. And the first thing I said, Mabel, the Pope wants to meet you. And there was dead silence. And then she said, what's he want to do, bless me? And I said, whoops, we're going to have to pitch this a little differently. So I said, well, Mabel, it'll just be like the professors, who come up and talk to you. And she goes, okay, well, then we can go to Happy Steak. And get in line at the senior buffet, and I could just see the Pope in line. Needless to say, it never happened because she wasn't impressed with any of that stuff. When Jerry Brown appointed her the first commissioner of the California Indian Commission, I asked her what did you think of Jerry Brown? Because I thought he was a really cool governor and all this kind of stuff. I said, what did you think of it? And she goes, oh, he's okay. The same thing she said when somebody said to her, oh, when I was getting a PhD, you must be proud of him. And she said, oh, yeah, he's okay. Those things, her second grade education, and she said she slept through most of that because she was dreaming. And she said her dream work interfered with school. So...
Well, so what she wasn't impressed with is kind of what I have never been impressed with about religion in general. And there's a lot of economic governmental critique in this analysis as well, as we think of top-down authority being something transmissible through some axiomatic mean that isn't apparent to me.
Mm-hmm.
As you said at the beginning of the conversation, you sit on the land, you know it enough.
Mm-hmm.
That is why, like, as a writer and as a guy who's deeply invested in learning true avenues towards, let's call it ecological fecundity, whether it's human ecology or more than human ecology, it's like, how do these systems not get drained of their vitality to reinvent themselves, to reorganize themselves, to become ever more resilient? Why I say things like this is one I've been wrestling with. It's like, I prefer conversation over conservation. Conservation is the imposition of policy. Okay, so this is me telling you
Mm-hmm.
what is important, and it's like, okay.
It's
it makes a
imposition on the
cartoon of
landscape.
reality. Yeah.
It's an imposition.
Mm-hmm.
And it's, again, if you're not careful, I like the idea of conservation, but it's an abstract idea, and it's only has meaning or relevance or health or not health in terms of how it's practiced.
In terms of how it's practiced. But that gets, like, the nuance of the argument is so readily lost in debate, especially debate as they're becoming more and more anemic of their language in the platforms in which they are presented, right? On the social media, for example. So much of it. And therefore, the it's like the language is getting simpler, and the arguments and even the things that we're talking about seem more superficial, or more like.
The language of preservation is really interesting because, Obi, the land will preserve itself. It don't need us, right? And yet there's still that arrogance, that sense of entitlement that we will, it won't survive without us. The flip side of that, with the same lot of the environmentalists, is we want to leave it just as it is. We're just as it is. It was never left just as it is.
Preservation. Yeah, and I would even question that assumption. Like, without us, California has never been California without people in the Holocene, you know, since the Pleistocene.
Yeah.
You know, like, humanity came and rearranged everything to such a degree that without us, it would be so wounded for so long that it would eventually come back as something else. Of course it would.
Yeah.
That's the nature of Gaia, and we're not going anywhere.
Right.
Right. I mean, what we're talking about ultimately is our own well-being.
Right.
And I'm not. And my criticism of the economics and the politics is not anti-regulation. I'm not that. I mean, I am a Democrat, small d, in that regard always, and a liberal, small l. You know, I do believe in the agency of the individual, and I do believe in the democratic vision of things. But I am reticent to call myself an environmentalist because of the righteousness that denies emergent phenomena across what is an incredibly complex system, which is why my books can't be any shorter than 700 freaking pages, you know, because, like, it takes that long to have this thought.
Yeah.
And, like, your thought, like, you use the word morals in your stories a lot. Like, there's kind of a moral here, there's kind of a moral here. I almost see them as, like, meta levels of analysis when they're aggregated in a book.
Yeah.
Or even just, like, even sometimes in just a word, like that word fixed you use regularly.
Yeah.
Fixed is something that's stuck,
Yeah.
but it's also something that's repaired.
Yes.
You
right,
know?
Yes.
You know?
Or fix. Yes. There you go. But I don't like the word moral, although we come to that, because morals, again, often will give you the give people the sense that it's about controlling or judging or that kind of thing. No, in my case, I would say, things that we need to remember about life when we forget that we're connected to everything. And we constantly will do that. I'll get scared, or I'll want to do this, or I'll want to do that. Even interpersonally, you'll say, God, I gotta certainly as a politician, I've seen where I've got to figure out a way to get my way with somebody, right?
Of course.
And that becomes, I may get my way, but continuing to behave that way for power and unbalance is where I have to draw the line, or at least be cognizant of what I'm doing. And I think too often in this world, politicians and all of us in many ways forget the consequences of behavior that doesn't have the whole in mind and only has you in mind.
I think that's a great place to start wrapping things up. We got a couple of comments and questions. Shall we?
Good.
Okay, so we have a comment from the Sierra State Parks Foundation.
Oops.
The majestic value of our public lands and the stories of memories and experiences that are cross-generational. Great conversation. Okay, so land as story of the public lands story.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, sure. Yeah. Well, that leads us into the announcement of who our next guest is next
perfect.
month,
Yes.
right?
What a segue.
I know so next week or next month, I think it's like the week after the 4th of July, if I can remember my calendar.
Don't ask me.
Don't ask me.
Ask Angela. She knows where I am. My assistant, everybody who takes such good care of me. As I always say, she knows where I'm going to be in 5 minutes. I don't. But
Very good. All right. Well, our next guest is Armando Quintero, who is the director of the California State Park System. And I think that this guest is perfect for us to end year 2. Our 24th episode. Armando's going to be sitting right here with us. And he is a poet and an artist. And he, like you, between the two worlds,
Mm-hmm.
he speaks English and Spanish perfectly. He's an artist, and he's such a brilliant painter.
Yeah.
Like his landscape
I
paintings.
didn't know that.
I know,
Yeah.
it's fascinating.
Yeah.
And he's a musician too.
yeah. Wow.
So he's,
I like that.
He's a
Yeah.
well-rounded guy, and he's a local guy here. He lives right here in Marin County. So we are going to talk next about the public space story, I think.
Perfect.
Next week. Yes.
Perfect.
And then we have another comment here from Chris Kaufmann. I recently visited an area involved in the Dixie fire burn, which was almost 1 million acres, almost a gigafire in total. A biologist said that there was more biodiversity after the fire. Yeah, that's something that happens with fire.
Yeah. Always.
Yeah, it frees up all these resources that were locked inside of all of this
remember the
green.
other thing that fire does is it kills a lot of the insects and stuff that feed on certain trees. One of the reasons we burned is all the moths and worms and stuff under the oak trees were destroyed.
Yeah.
So we would have greater harvests that weren't compromised by bugs and worms and so forth. Fire also kills all kinds of other diseases. One of the problems with domestication of animals is, of course, that's how we got so many of the diseases that we have today. But when you have so many domestic animals, you can't burn. You need what's there, and so you're going to have disease build upon disease. Fire is cleansing. Hence we had fire doctors, as I told you last episode.
Right. We've got today's giveaway winner.
Oh, great!
From Reno, Nevada.
This is my latest book, by the way.
Oh,
that
right.
we talked about.
You get one of
The
my
Forgetters.
books too. I didn't.
Oh, good.
I didn't bring any of my books. I brought everybody else's book, as I do.
But you brought your box.
I got
Obi wouldn't be. Obi's like this traveling bookstore that goes around with these boxes. And folks, you got to appreciate him because there's some pretty steep, rocky terrain here, and he lugs these things up and down. And so far, he hasn't twisted or broken ankle or rolled around or become fodder for the buzzards. But you're doing good.
I carry them around in my car. I feel like it's some sort of ballast for the, like against the madness.
Our last meeting,
What
you
discourse?
didn't have them for some reason. I felt something was missing.
That's great. Yeah. That's great. Well, our giveaway winner. So you go to placeandpurpose.live, enter your email, and you might get a chance to get a signed copy of our books. And her name is Thea Maria. Thea Maria from Reno, Nevada. Thank you so much for being our
Thank you,
listener.
Thea. Thank you and all everybody for listening and caring.
It's true. It's true. I think I have other questions for you, Greg. I mean, the conversation goes on and on. I'd like to talk more about story as entertainment and story as learning. There's so many complementary ideas here always to balance. And I think my question woman to your answer woman, and sometimes we switch those roles, is such a wonderful way to go about it. So I really thank you for indulging me. I sort of insisted on no guest this time because I wanted to work through some of this stuff.
Yeah, that
today.
was Obi's idea, by the way.
But next time we've got Armando Quintero, and for now, thank you once again for
Thanks.
Place
Great
and Purpose.
Conversation this morning, and again, thank you people for listening. And remember, the hummingbird's doing its work, the grasses and flowers are doing theirs. We can do ours.